end of it. After the collapse of the Camp David negotiations, President Clinton recognized that the U.S.-Israeli position at the negotiations could not be accepted by any Palestinians, even the most, what are called moderate ones, pro-U.S. ones. So Clinton, in December of 2000, issued what he called his parameters. They were kind of vague, but somewhat more forthcoming. He then said that both sides, Israel and the Palestinians, had accepted his parameters. Both sides had made reservations to them. Well, they met in Taba, Egypt in January 2001 to try to iron out the differences, the reservations. And they made quite a bit of success. In their last press conference, we know a lot about this. It was internationally monitored. There's extensive reports from Israel, most of it in Hebrew, but some in English. So we know quite a lot about it. They practically reached agreement. In their last press conference, they said if they had a few more days, they could have reached agreement on every issue, pretty much in line with the international consensus, tweaking it here and there. There were a few issues still. Israel called off the negotiations prematurely, and that was the end of formal negotiations. Informal, pretty high-level negotiations continued, leading to some agreements, the main ones called the Geneva Accord. It was rejected by Israel, ignored by the United States, so that's down the tube. All of this is quite significant. It means that a resolution in terms of the international consensus is feasible if the United States will permit it. Unfortunately, there's very little sign of that. Well, meanwhile, the U.S. and Israel are just extending and deepening the illegal occupation. In 2005, September 2005, Israel made a sensible tactical decision, the right-wing government, Ariel Sharon's decision. The government decided that it doesn't make any sense to keep 7,000 or 8,000 Israeli settlers in the Gaza Strip, which by then had been half destroyed, taking maybe a third or more of the resources and land, and protected by half the Israeli army. So he made the decision to transfer the settlers illegally settling in the Gaza Strip to the West Bank, which is much more important. Now, it could have been done just like that, just a flick of a wrist, But they decided to stage what was called a national trauma. So there was a huge trauma, completely farcical. If they'd want to do it quietly, all they had to do was announce that on August 1st, the IDF, the Israeli army, is going to leave the Gaza Strip. At that point, the 8,000 settlers would have climbed into the trucks provided to them, and they would leave their subsidized homes in the Gaza Strip to subsidized homes in the West Bank. But you don't get any propaganda out of that. What they wanted was a trauma. So it was staged, big front pictures on the front pages of, a little boy pleading with the soldiers not to destroy his home, Boston Globe and so on, and shouts of never again and so on, no more Holocausts. And it was pretty effective. Actually, it was a farcical repeat of a similar staged trauma in 1982 when they had to take settlers out of Egypt, out of the northeastern Sinai. There were commentators in Israel who just ridiculed it correctly, like one of Israel's leading sociologists, Baruch Kimmerling, died recently, wrote just ridiculed the farce as it should have been done. But it played where it mattered, here. So never again. We've got to hold on to the West Bank. Well, after the technical withdrawal from Gaza, Israel maintained its total control, and it was pretty vicious. It picked up in intensity a couple of months later when the Palestinians committed a serious crime. There was a free election in Palestine in January 2006, and they voted the wrong way. Now, that's not acceptable. You can do all kind of things, but not that. You don't vote the wrong way in a free election. So the U.S. quite openly, Israel too, of course, turned to punishing the Palestinians for this crime. And it wasn't secret. Like, you can read it in a column on the front page of the New York Times, right alongside another column which is lauding our magnificent messianic pursuit of Wilsonian ideals and supporting democracy and so on. There's no contradiction. Orwell, you may recall, had a concept which he called doublethink. Doublethink is the capacity to have two contradictory ideas in mind at the same time and believe both of them. That's almost a definition of the intellectual culture. But this was a dramatic case. And immediately after that crime, the punishment of the Gaza Strip sharply increased. Got worse later. I won't go through the details, but it's pretty awful. Very savage siege, brutality, and so on. It peaked December 2008 with the latest U.S.-Israeli invasion, which was murderous and destructive. The invasion, it's called an Israeli invasion. It's a U.S.-Israeli invasion. U.S. arms, U.S. diplomatic support, and so on. It was given a pretext, but every act of aggression has a pretext, so you have to ask, does it mean anything? Actually, the pretext was that Israel was defending itself against rockets from Gaza. That pretext is accepted by the human rights groups, by the Goldstone Commission, by about 100% of commentary. It doesn't have a particle of credibility. Israel and the U.S. knew exactly how to stop the rockets. There had been a ceasefire, and during the ceasefire, Israel admits there was not a single Hamas rocket. Israel violated the ceasefire a couple of months earlier, and the rockets started. Hamas called for renewing the ceasefire. Israel considered it and refused. Well, you know, the use of force when you haven't exhausted, even tried peaceful means is just pure, it's just major war crimes. I mean, the discussion about the war crimes in Gaza is trivial in comparison. So Israel, in fact, got a free pass from the Goldstone report and others. Well, since then, the savagery continues. I won't go on the details. I'm talking too long. It's pretty similar in the West Bank. The restrictions are not as severe in the West Bank as they are in Gaza, which has become basically unlivable. That's the point. But they're bad. But Israel has finally understood in the West Bank that it should do what every colonial power has done. They don't punish the entire population. Ensure that the elites are making out fine. You go to any third world country, you know, under colonial rule or neo-colonial rule, and there's a sector of wealth and privilege which is, you know, beyond anything that we dream of. And Israel's finally understood that that's what you do. So if you go to Ramallah, you can go to elegant restaurants and you know, go to the theater. It's just like being in Paris and London. You go a couple of miles away, and it's horrible. But that allows the journalists and others to talk about the wonderful achievements in the West Bank. Well, when you run in fact, Israel is following, finally, the explicit recommendation of Israeli industrialists about 10 years ago, who urged that Israel should move from, what their words, from colonialism to neo-colonialism. It should establish the standard neo-colonial structures like this. It took a long time to realize it, but they're doing it. In fact, that becomes even more like South Africa. South Africa relied on the Bantustans, and it tried to keep them, they're pretty awful, but it tried to keep them viable. It needed them. That was their labor force. So they kept them going. They tried to get international recognition for them, but outside Israel, no country recognized them. But Israel's not doing it for all the West Bank. It's just doing it for the elite sector in Ramallah, where the Palestinian Authority is. Well, if you want to maintain a neo-colonial system, you have to have an iron fist, so you need military force. And there is one. It's the army run by General Keith Dayton. Actually, that's the more mild of the military forces, but the better known one. U.S. general runs an army trained in Jordan with Israeli participation and support, and it keeps a grip over the population. In fact, the Obama administration was particularly impressed by how well the army worked during the attack on Gaza. During the attack on Gaza, there were no protests in the West Bank, which kind of surprised everyone. And that's attributed to the power of the Dayton army, which prevented any protests. So Palestinians, of course, they can't demonstrate or anything, but they were not even allowed to protest the destruction of the other half of Palestine, what's going on in Gaza. John Kerry, in particular, head of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, was particularly impressed with this. And he said, finally, he said, Israel may have a legitimate partner for peace, thanks to the success of the General Dayton Army in suppressing the population sufficiently so they can't even protest against massive atrocities. Well, let's turn finally to the options for Palestinians. What are they? Here the discussion, I think, is pretty misleading, and you should think it through. One option, of course, is the international consensus, and there's a barrier. The U.S. won't accept it, but that's our problem. Now, a very common view, you hear it all over the place now from Palestinians, from Israeli doves, from the supporters of Palestinians here, that the alternative to that is that Israel takes over the territories, it becomes a single state, and you can have a civil rights struggle, an anti-apartheid struggle within this single state in which Palestinians will be roughly half the population. And that's many of the doves, including Palestinian leaders, think, okay, that's better than the vanishing two-state settlement. There's only one problem with that logic. Those are not the two alternatives. There's a third alternative, which isn't discussed. The third alternative is that the U.S. and Israel continue doing exactly what they're doing. And what they're doing is very clear. It has a name. Prime Minister Ehud Olmert called it convergence. What you do, what Israel with U.S. backing is doing, is taking over everything, annexing everything behind the separation wall, some of the most valuable land, all the water resources, that's quite crucial in this arid region. It takes over the Jordan Valley, more fertile territory, kicks out the Palestinians, and runs some salients, settlement salients right through the territories. Actually, there are three of them. Big one east of Greater Jerusalem. Jerusalem's been sharply expanded. There's one that goes almost to Jericho, and two others to the north, one taking in the town of Ariel, the other town of Kadumim. You take a look at a map. If you look at a map, it looks as if it doesn't penetrate too deeply into the West Bank, but that's misleading because the area where it doesn't penetrate is mostly rocky desert where you can't settle. The livable part of the West Bank is broken up into four major cantons, what Ariel Sharon, in fact, the architect of this, called Bantustans. He was honest, except that they're not cared for as well as the Bantustans. So Israel will take those, no demographic problem, very few Palestinians. If there are a few, you kick them out. No problem of too many non-Jews in a Jewish state, no civil rights struggle, no apartheid struggle. As for the Palestinians, they can rot up in the hills. Israel takes no responsibility for them. They can follow a proposal of Moshe Dayan back in '67, the defense minister who was in charge. He said we should tell the Palestinians that we have no solution for you. You're going to live like dogs, and whoever wants to leave can leave, and we'll see where that goes. Well, yeah, that's the policy. And that's the real alternative to a two-state settlement. There is no alternative of the kind that's being discussed, because neither Israel nor the United States, nor in fact anyone in the world, is going to accept that. Rather, they'll continue doing exactly what they're doing. Now, that's not going to change unless there are changes inside the United States. As in the current world scene, it's hard to see where else changes could come from. And that's kind of an optimistic conclusion for us. for people who oppose current U.S.-Israeli policies, because here is the one place where we can influence what happens. And here is the one place that matters. That's where there's going to make a decisive difference. Now, there are implications for tactical choices. I think they should be pretty obvious, but I'll stop there. Sorry to have gone on too long. Take a look at the history of apartheid. It's suggestive. Not exact, but suggestive. Took decades of education and organizing, things like this, before the situation in the United States reached the point where Congress, the business world, general population, was so opposed to apartheid that the Reagan administration had to lie its way around it to try to maintain the support. Well, okay, that's one thing that could be done. Another thing that could be done is what began in the case of South Africa in the late 70s, namely divestment. By then, it already had the support of a large part of the population, including even businesses and pretty soon Congress, but the requirement that U.S. corporations divest from white nationalist firms in South Africa, which they themselves are already beginning to do under pressure here. Okay, that can be done. Now that's, and you can go beyond. There were a number of international reports about the Gaza attack. One of the most important was from Amnesty International, not exactly an extremist organization. They called on the United States to withhold all arms shipments from Israel, saying that the arms shipments violate international law, which they do, and they even violate U.S. domestic law. Arms shipments are supposed to be subject to the condition that they are used only for defensive purposes or for, internal security. And the Gaza attack had no defensive purpose, as I mentioned, and certainly wasn't for internal security. And they were used in commission of major crimes, crime of aggression, lots of other war crimes. So there could be a popular movement here to call on the U.S. government to live up to its own laws and to terminate arms shipments. And there's a lot of other things, So there's no shortage of things that we can do. Well, it's no deep secret. Like we're doing right now. How did people, just take a look at the change, just take the recent years in the United States. You can go all the way back in history. But or you go back further. How was slavery overcome? How did women get the right to vote? How since the 1960s were women's rights pretty substantially established, not perfect, but totally different from anything before. How were civil rights achieved? How did environmental concerns begin to be addressed? Not well enough, but at least somewhat. And every step forward in history comes the same way. And people like you do something about it. And it's a very free country. You can do all sorts of things. People in universities are extremely privileged. Students, for example, are in the moment of their lives when they are most free. They're sort of out of parental control. They don't yet have the burdens imposed on them to try to survive in a society where incomes for the majority have stagnated for 30 years because of government corporate policies. So they're kind of free. They can do lots of things that others don't have a choice about. Okay, do them. Yeah, that's fine. I think that's one of the things you can do, but there's plenty more. We all know that a vote doesn't mean much.
Thank you. It doesn't.
A vote, in more democratic countries than ours, that's understood. Like, take, say, the poorest country in South America, Bolivia. They had a pretty remarkable election in 2005, another one just last year, in which the majority of the population, indigenous, people, the most repressed people in the continent, had by then organized enough to enter the political arena and vote somebody from their own ranks. Not some rich guy from, who went to Skull and Bones at Yale. But they've elected someone from their own ranks. They formulated the programs, which the president is following, serious programs. And the voting was just one moment in an ongoing struggle. It wasn't, I go to the polls, I push a button, and I forget about it for the next 4 years. There's just an ongoing popular struggle about all kind of serious issues, access to water, control of resources, complex questions of ethnic and civil rights in a complex society. And they're at it all day, all the time. Okay, that's functioning democracy. We've got a long way to go. But we've had it in the past, but it's kind of been suppressed. And it can be recovered. And that's what elections ought to be, just a moment in a process which goes on from there.
Hi. First, thank you so much for coming. I've learned a lot listening to what you shared with us. My question is specifically about Iran and the nuclear weapons and the discussion that you were having with regard to Iran and the international community. I definitely understand the idea of a country obtaining a nuclear weapon or developing one themselves out of a form of protection or to be on the same, I guess, international status as other countries who are considered superpowers or on the same level as a superpower because they themselves have nuclear weapons. But what do you do when a country is openly trying to develop one or obtain one and also openly threatening to wipe out a country and claiming that a country shouldn't exist? I mean, those are two really big issues that we're dealing with, and I didn't really think you addressed that, and I was curious what you had to say.
Well, what do you do about countries that already developed nuclear weapons outside the framework of the Non-Proliferation Treaty and are daily violating resolutions of the Security Council and the International Atomic Energy Agency? I mean, that's the much more serious problem.
But that's a different situation because those countries aren't openly threatening to wipe out another country.
Nor is Iran. Just take a look at the statements. The statements are that they don't think, they said actually it goes back to Khomeini, at the time of the U.S.-Iranian alliance, the Israeli-Iranian alliance, and Israel didn't care about it then. And it keeps being repeated. The statement is that, in the course of time, Israel should no longer exist. Well, actually, I happen to agree with that too. In fact, so do a lot of people in Israel, the ones who think there should be a single democratic state. That's not calling for wiping anyone out. In fact, Iran has supported the international consensus on the two-state settlement. Actually, there are two countries that are not only calling for some nation not to exist, but are destroying it, namely the U.S. and Israel. That's their position with regard to the Palestinians. And they're not just saying it. I stress, they're not just saying it, they're doing it day by day. That's the meaning of the policies that are going on right before our eyes in Gaza and the West Bank, which we are supporting and paying for. So sure, you shouldn't call for the destruction of another nation, and you shouldn't implement that. Actually, the official position of Israel, backed by the United States, they've slightly modified it, but back about 20 years ago, their official position, the coalition government, Labor, Likud, was that there cannot be, I'm quoting it, an additional Palestinian state between Jordan and Israel. In other words, they declared, and the U.S. supported that there already is a Palestinian state, namely Jordan. I mean, the Palestinians object. They say, no, wait a minute, that's not our state. But who cares about them? We say that's your state, and there can't be an additional one. Well, that goes well beyond calling for the destruction of another country. I mean, it's analogous to saying that if somebody came along, suppose Ahmadinejad said, Jews don't need Israel because they already have New York. Okay? I mean, we'd call that a revival of Nazism. But that's the official, has been the official U.S.-Israeli position. So there's a lot to be, incidentally, about Iran. Nobody in their right mind wants Iran to have nuclear weapons, or anyone else. But it is well, and it's a horrible regime, undoubtedly, though there are worse ones in the region, which are our allies. Everyone, and I'm not referring to Israel, I'm referring to the other Arab states. I mean, in comparison with Saudi Arabia, Iran looks like a civil rights paradise. But it's awful, no doubt. And there's a way to deal with it. Like, for example, moving towards a nuclear weapons-free zone. But among strategic analysts, including Israeli ones, there's no real question about why Iran is moving to nuclear weapons capability, which is not the same as having nuclear weapons. It's just being at a point where you could have them. Like most of the advanced industrial world is in that position. Japan, Italy, all sorts of countries. The reason is very simple. Actually, it was described by one of Israel's leading military analysts, very hawkish, Martin von Crefeld, a couple of years ago. After the invasion of Iraq, he wrote an article in which he said he doesn't know if Iran is developing nuclear weapons, and he hopes not, but he says if they're not developing nuclear weapons, they are crazy. That was his word. They're not developing them, they're crazy. The United States has just announced we're going to attack anybody we feel like and invade you if we can do it with impunity. So you better have a deterrent. Well, maybe they're developing a deterrent. No serious analyst thinks that they could use nuclear weapons. I mean, if Iran had nuclear weapons and missiles, which nobody sane wants them to have, I mean, if they went as far as even loading a missile, the country would be vaporized, instantly, even if there was any suspicion of it. Well, the clerics may be hideous people, but they've shown no particular inclination for suicide and destruction of everything that they own and everything they value. Same is true about leaking nuclear weapons to others. If there was any suspicion that they were doing that, you can say goodbye to Iran. So the chances they're using it are, probably at the level of an asteroid hitting the Earth or something like that. But it's a serious problem. In fact, if you look at the Israeli literature, they're pretty straight about it. They say that the real threat of an Iranian nuclear weapon is not against Israel, but it's against Zionism. That is, what they're afraid of is that if the region becomes too dangerous, people in Israel are just going to leave. People who have the capacity to, more educated, wealthier, and so on, because they won't want to live in a region with that threat. And in fact, emigration is a pretty serious problem. Emigration of the educated and the trained, educated sectors. So they don't want to face that threat. But I don't think any serious strategic analyst, at least I've never seen one, who thinks that there's the threat that Iran might use a nuclear weapon. I mean, it would total suicide.
Thank you.
First, thank you, and good evening, Dr. Chomsky. My question is concerning the, just getting information. How do we inform the intellectual classes? Where do you find your information, and how do you access truth in a media that's so corrupt and overtaken by corporate interests?
Just how do you become a good biologist? You work, I mean, the important results aren't like written in boldface. I mean, the best biologist is not somebody who read all the technical papers there are. I mean, you can't do that. You have to know what to look for. And you have to, take, say, some of the things I mentioned, like the International Atomic Energy Agency resolution on Israel that I mentioned. Well, I was lucky. I happened to be in Mexico last September. And they happen to have an independent newspaper in Mexico. It's the only one in the Western Hemisphere that I know of. Very good newspaper, big newspaper, second largest in Mexico, gets no commercial advertising because business won't advertise there. But they do very well just on reader support. And while I was there, they happened to run an Associated Press piece on this. Well, I didn't know whether to believe it or not, so when I came home, I checked up Associated Press, which is on the internet, and yeah, it's true. Then I did a media search, and I found out that there was one mention of it in the United States in the Mooney paper in Washington, the Washington Times. There was also one in the United Kingdom in the Irish Times. Okay, that's the kind of thing you got to do on all sorts of issues. If you know what you're looking for and you're willing to put the effort into it, you can find out a lot of things. Now, for an individual, it's extremely hard. You have to be kind of a fanatic. But if you're in a group, if you're part of an organization, it gets a lot easier. That's one of the advantages of joining with other people. You can do a lot of things you can't do by yourself. So if somebody finds something, you disseminate it, others help out, and pretty soon you get things done.
And one more thing, if you could just quickly repeat the column you mentioned in the beginning of your talk.
Oh, this morning's New York Times. Ethan Brunner.
All right, thanks.
Who I think is a terrible correspondent, but he happened to have a good column this morning, good, honest column. Now, he also did his homework. He dug up the Shavit article, which I didn't expect. I don't think it's in English, so it's in Hebrew, I believe. And he also dug up that international poll, which I haven't seen reported anywhere.
So thanks for coming again. I recently watched the classic video of you with William F. Buckley debating the Vietnam War back in the 60s. And so I feel like you've been asked probably every question underneath the sun. So I guess my question would be, what does Noam Chomsky now wish that Noam Chomsky back when he was debating Buckley in the 60s, what did he wish he knew? And if you could also indulge us, what is your happiest moment in life?
I don't answer personal questions. There are some. Well, I don't actually remember. I think that debate was in '69, so I can't remember it in any detail. But looking back at the period in general, my main regret is I was much too mild. I should have been taking a much stronger position.
Buckley would disagree with that.
He would disagree, yeah. But if I was having a debate with some Soviet commissar and I criticized what Russia was doing, he'd say it's too harsh. But maybe you have to remember that it was not easy then. In retrospect, the sort of fairy tale is that everyone was opposed to the war. That's absolutely untrue. In the early stages of the war in Vietnam, it was much harder to talk about than it is to talk about Israel-Palestine today. As late as October 1965, that's 3 years after Kennedy had launched a major war against the South. In fact, the South was practically destroyed. We tried to have our first public meeting in Boston. Boston's a pretty liberal city. And there's a place in downtown Boston, the Boston Common, which is dedicated to open meetings. So we figured, okay, we'll take a chance and have a public meeting on the Boston Common criticizing the war, very mild criticisms. It was broken up by students. If it wasn't that there were a couple hundred state police there, we probably all would have been killed. The Boston Globe, the liberal newspaper, huge denunciation. How dare you stand up and criticize our magnificent government and so on. It took a long time before any kind of a peace movement developed. And then if you look at how it developed, in fact, you can read this today in your history books and in the press and so on, what developed was quite different in the elite culture and in the popular culture. If you look at the elite culture, which you're going to read in a history book or in the newspapers and so on, was that there was a debate over whether the war was winnable or not. Okay. In fact, when people make analogies to Afghanistan, or Iraq, they say, well,